Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and welcome to This Week in Mythic Plus. This week's affixes are Prideful, and then the other three I actually don't know at the time of recording this. The educated guess that's being made is Bursting Volcanic Fortified, but that might be wrong. So this week I'm going to make a video just all about the Prideful affix, all about basic strategies for each dungeon with Prideful in play. Going to go through all 8 dungeons with MDT, Mythic Dungeon Tools, up. And show you my strategies for each of these dungeons, kind of default that you can use regardless of what affixes actually are active. These can be found also at Raider.io. I have the weekly route series that I write over there, where you can get import links for all of these, and I'll have a link to that article in the description below. And that should also contain information about what the actual affixes are this week, although I'm sure that you can find that out as soon as this goes live. I really hope I'm right. I hope it is Bursting Volcanic, but if it's not, then that'll be relevant too. Maybe I'll make a pinned comment if I don't know. This video is going to come out when I'm asleep, so give me a little bit of time. But anyways, let's get started with The Other Side. This is a dungeon that has pretty nice Prideful timings if you do a little bit of a weird thing with the route. So again, the way Prideful works is that every 20% of enemy forces that you slay, you will spawn a Prideful mob. If you use MDT and segregate all of your pulls using the built-in new pull functionality, it will actually show you where your prides are gonna spawn, on which pull they're spawning, which is extremely helpful for mapping this out. And so the basic idea in The Other Side is if you're willing to go and pull this pack, and then instead of going into this wing of Zul'Gurub, going all the way down here and pulling these packs, you'll spawn a Prideful here, and you'll also set up your count such that when you then backtrack, go into Zul'Gurub, and kill this 4-pack here, you'll spawn Prideful, kill Prideful, and then you get that nice buff going into Hakar. And then you go around here, and the next Prideful you're going to spawn is after you come out and come back down to Mechagon. You kill these 3, you get Prideful, and you can take that into the Mana Storms. And then you get your last Prideful, so that the area that's kind of the most different routing, depending on how skilled your group is going to be and how comfortable you are with big pulls, is going to be the Ardenweald area of The Other Side. This strategy that I have here is one that does it in quite a lot of pulls. You can pull bigger here if you are feeling comfortable with it, and particularly if your group contains a lot of specs that aren't hard capped at 5 targets. But if your group does contain a lot of those specs, you're already above that in many of these pulls, and you're really not going to benefit by pulling anything more. But here you'd be getting a Prideful halfway through these pulls, and then one that you can bring onto the dealer. And then you won't have one for Muezela. That fight can be pretty tough, but there's not really a good way to have a Prideful onto it, as far as I can tell. Unless, maybe there's something you can do where you, like, leave this pack until the end and you spawn a Prideful off of it or something. But this is the pathing that looks the most straightforward to me. You basically are just doing the dungeon in a linear fashion, except with this weird zigzag here, and that sets up Pridefuls onto 3 of the 4 bosses. Pretty good outcome. Up next is Halls of Atonement. Halls of Atonement is a Venthyr dungeon. Actually, Venthyr get a pretty big benefit in here, where you can mind control these loyal Stoneborns. I forgot to mention it in The Other Side, but there's a benefit for Night Fae in that dungeon, where they can have earned AoE stuns. You can actually check out my video on Covenant-specific dungeon abilities here, but the good news, if you don't have a Venthyr, is you can just skip all these loyal Stoneborns. None of them are linked to any important pulls. And the pathing through here, I don't know how you've been doing it in M0s, but it's basically the same as I've been doing it in my M0s, with a little bit more enemies pulled in order to facilitate actually getting, 100% count. So you just start in here, go up to the right, pull this pack here. You get Prideful from the pack before this pull, and then you can take that Pride bonus to help kill these 2. And then you come back around this way, down here. These mobs are pretty dangerous, so be careful of the Vicious Gargons here. These things will mess your tank up. So them being ready to kite, or stunning them as things get low, and making absolutely sure that Loyal Beast does not go off is going to be vital for this area. So you kill that. You can actually sneak around up through here to avoid... this is a patrol, so you can avoid this fairly easily, and if you are a Venthyr, you can grab this Stoneborn along the way. Grab this middle pack, and once you kill, 2 of these mobs, you'll spawn the Prideful, so you ideally want them to all die at about the same time, so that you can spawn your Prideful without being in the middle of the pull. Or if you're feeling confident, you can kill 2 mobs quickly, spawn the Prideful, and then cleave it down with the rest of the pull. Up to you there on which of those feels like more of your speed. And then you can take the Pride buff into Halkias, do a couple pulls here, get a Prideful off of this into Echelon, hop into this part of the dungeon, You won't have Prideful onto Elise, but if you do have a Venthyr player, you can get both of these Stoneborns onto her. You just take one Stoneborn with you when you're going to pull the boss, mind control it, and then somebody can tag the other one with a ranged ability once your first Stoneborn flies away, mind control it, and blow her up. Then you get to this big uncapped AoE room. This room is really nice if you have something like a Balance Druid with Starfall, a Hunter with Barrage if they've talented into that, or really just anybody who's able to deploy large amounts of uncapped AoE to kill off all these souls, because you're not going to be able to just burst down Cigar once you get to a high enough key level. However, you might be still operating at a level, especially if you're overgeared or if you've got some high single target DPS, some raid specs in your group, you might actually be able to burst down Cigar before they cast the second thing that heals everything up and it becomes a big problem. So consider doing that if that's something that you think might be possible for your group. And then you go into the last boss with the Pride from this pull, and that works out pretty nicely. Tirna Scithe. This is a Night Fae dungeon. Night Fae can allow you to skip these pulls right here at the start and go left instead. And if you're then also able to skip this pull, you can line up a Pride onto the first boss. Otherwise, you're going to have Prideful somewhere in your first couple trash pulls. Don't worry about it if that happens. You don't really need it for the first boss, although it is certainly nice. Night Fae can also get you the bonus mushrooms here, so definitely take advantage of that if you do have one in the group. Then you get to the maze segment. The maze segment is huge amounts of randomness. Not huge, but noticeable amounts of randomness. And from run to run can represent quite different amounts of count. So if you end up getting... With this pathing here, if you're going to pull this much at the start, and if you also get a long maze route, you basically have no options besides maybe skipping one of these pulls to avoid going over count. But if you do end up with a very light maze route and you've skipped some stuff near the start, then you may need to actually pull some extra stuff. And usually the way that would work is you would do these pulls towards Tredova, and then you could grab one or even two pulls from the other side of Tredova. These two end up usually being the easiest ways to pick up a little bit of extra count. And you can either do that before Tredova to get a Prideful buff to make Tredova easier, or you can do it after Tredova, and then you avoid having to kill the Pride, because as soon as you kill the last mob, the timer stops, right? That's a little bit faster, but a little bit more dangerous. All right, up next is Plaguefall. Plaguefall is a Necrolord dungeon where Necrolords can fleshcraft off of these different slimes to get a nice haste and damage reduction aura around themselves. That's relevant both for the second boss, and going into this last area, you can grab it actually from off the side where you might not normally look. There's one of each type of slime up there as well. The trash in this dungeon is pretty hostile, especially near the start, so avoid pulling this if you can. Make sure you don't pull the Hornets. These packs are a lot less bad than the Hornets, but really a good strategy as you start getting to higher keys is going to be to skip this and instead pull some more stuff in this area. That may not be an option for you, or you may not be interested in doing that, so that's why I've included it in the basic route here. And the nice thing about doing this as well is that you get a Pride onto the first boss, which is always helpful. This strategy involves not pulling this Plague Belcher. If you don't trust your group to not do that, of course, just pull it, that's fine too. And then, make your way through the rest of the dungeon. If you're used to Mythic 0, you may have been used to skipping most of these mobs by hugging left. That's not something that works out for count in Mythic Plus, so you're going to need to fight these guys. They're really not as scary as they look, especially the big Spine Breaker. This guy looks scary, is actually one of the least dangerous mobs in the area. Make sure you're making good use of these unstable canisters. They do a big AoE when they die to all the enemies and allies in the range, except only target cap to 5, so when I said the word all there, it was really a blatant lie. Then there's the tentacles in this area. You can skip this by hugging right along the wall as you get through here. Do that. These tendies not only suck, they're not worth much count, and you can't really pull stuff onto them all that effectively. So I would avoid these. If you end up in a group that's, sometimes you're in those pugs where no matter what you type, the people are just going to run through the dungeon in a straight line. So if that happens, somebody's going to run in and spawn one of these things. Even if you type for like 3 times before you get to this area, remember to hug right. There's going to be that one person in your group, and they always run and spawn this thing. So if that happens, not the end of the world, you can just kill him. But ideally, you want to skip around here. And that facilitates some nice Prideful timings for the rest of the dungeon as well, where you can get a Pride onto the second boss. The third boss requires a little bit of finesse to get a Pride on it here, and this route doesn't actually do it. You would need to sneak through here and then pull these and then back pull this afterwards if you wanted to get Pride onto this boss. And then of course the last boss, very natural. You'll almost always have Pride onto last bosses of dungeons because you'll trigger it from the 100% trash wave. Sanguine Depths is a Venthyr dungeon. We've got some lanterns throughout the dungeon you can click on to collect some souls, give your group a nice buff as you kill stuff near them. That's going to scale really well with coordinated groups. In less coordinated groups, just click them when you see them if you've got a Venthyr and take whatever benefit you get. I've got some double pulls listed in here, but honestly, if your group is not feeling comfortable with that, you can do, instead of this whole area as 4 pulls, you can do it as 2 pulls, you could do it as 4 if you wanted. I would advise skipping these things. It's pretty easy to do. You just wait for them to patrol in the good direction. This thing kind of patrols in a big rectangle around this area. You just wait for it to be over here and then sneak on through. And then you're killing stuff all the rest of the way through here. There's a Venthyr Lantern here that fills up very nicely from all these Wicked Oppressors. And then you go to Prideful, and then you can take the Pride and maybe still some damage buff onto these pulls. And that can work out really nicely in a good group. Here you can go left or right. Both are fine. And one of the Chamber Sentinels along the way will usually activate. I haven't been able to nail it down entirely, but I believe that a different one will activate depending on which week you're on. I think that sometimes one will be active and sometimes won't. If you want to check for sure, you can actually throw a distract if you've got a rogue in your group at these sentinels, and if the distract makes them move, then that one is going to wake up when you walk next to it. So be on the lookout for that little tip. Then you get into the rest of the dungeon. Pretty straightforward stuff. You kill the mobs. You get a Pride here. You go into this area. This area is a big slog. Make sure that your healer's full mana before you get in combat here, because they're not leaving combat for a while. And there's a Venthyr Lantern here that is also very nice for taking on to the rest of the run. Up next is Spires of Ascension. This dungeon is, I think, a good candidate for one of the ones where there's least creativity available here. Obviously, it's very early for me to say that, and I could end up very much eating my words, but it feels like a lot of these pulls, there's really not too many options for things you can do differently. One big choice you have is between going right and going left in this area. Neither one is great. There's just awful mobs on both sides. I've elected to suggest going right because I think that is a little bit easier by default. I think if you want to line up a Prideful on the second boss, though, which this route does not do, it's a little bit easier to do that going left. If you do that going right, you basically have to pull both of these pulls to make that work, and that's kind of scuffed. These pulls are awful, but that's also an option. So there are really 3 different ways that you can attack this dungeon. There's also Kyrian Spears you can pick up in this dungeon. One here, one over on that side as well, and one here that are an AoE stun and damage taken increase, and those can be really nice when you're fighting these final Valkyr at the end here. These things are so difficult to kill. The path that I have right now, because I'm trying to avoid using any skips at all, is fighting everything here. You could pretty easily adjust this route by skipping these guys, and then that would mean that you get a Prideful onto the last boss. As it stands right now, I'm actually getting a Prideful onto the last Valkyr, which may also be really helpful. These Valkyr do not mess around, and having a Prideful buff for one can really help. But it means you are going over count, so it is a little inefficient. Necrotic Wake is another Kyrian dungeon. The Kyrian buff here is just that you can activate these Colossus Goliath things, get some anime balls, charge yourself up that way. There's also a ton of spears and hammers and other anime balls, so many anime balls in this dungeon that you can get that are really powerful extra action buttons you can use, and certainly in high-end groups, using those to their full effect is going to make this dungeon a lot easier, and it's going to be the cornerstone of strategy in this dungeon. The path that I'm suggesting here is a lot simpler. You just meander over on the left, get a nice little Prideful onto the first boss, and then we're actually going to pull all this stuff through here and just cut a nice line through all these mobs. Now, the downsides of this path is you're going to fight this pack, you're going to fight this guy, you're going to fight this pack. All of those are hard packs, so this path that I'm suggesting, it values ease of the pathing, right? You're not having to do any complicated skips. You're not having to corral your group to hug right and avoid pulling this stuff. You're not having to use like Invis Pots or Shroud to get past this guy. So I'm valuing ease of the pathing over the ease of the pulls themselves. If you're getting to a high key level, or if you're in a coordinated group, I would advise instead, skip this pack, skip this guy, hug right instead, pull these guys, and you can even skip these guys and jump over the side here. And that will be a route that has easier combat, but you're going to have a much harder time if you're in a less coordinated group, pulling that off and not accidentally having somebody screw it up and pull extra mobs and wiping, and then your Invis Pots are on cooldown and the whole thing is coming apart at the seams. People leave your group, they flame you, they write a negative review on Reddit, your life's in shambles, right? So that's the main thing that can happen in Necrotic Wake. So really, if you're scared of that, you just avoid the dungeon entirely and go to Theater of Pain. Theater of Pain is a 5-boss dungeon. That's a lot of bosses. If this week's tyrannical, which I don't think it is, but if it is, that's something to that you'll be acutely aware of in here. There's not too many options in this dungeon for Prideful, unfortunately. You can get it on 2 bosses fairly easily out of 5, and 3 with some work, but there's basically no way to get Prideful onto either of these bosses without doing some weird stuff. This boss is actually impossible. This boss, you could do it if you were being super weird, so maybe that strategy is going to end up being good, but for a basic strategy, I'm advising hopping on down after you kill the first boss, going to the duel area first. Their friendships are broken, so if you've got people in your group that are going to have their feelings hurt after losing a duel, maybe go there last instead. But for the purposes of Prideful, it's pretty nice because you get an easy Prideful onto this boss from hitting 40% from this mob. Then after that, I'm suggesting hopping over to the Altars of Agony. This is the platformer section. My preference is to go right and then left. Going right or left at the first just decides between these two. Either way afterwards, you'll end up on this platform. And then here, going left will get you to the Dark Speakers, whereas going right will get you to the Bone Storm, Soulforged Bone Reaver guy. And I find that that is a worse outcome, so I would almost always advise going left here and instead fighting these Dark Speakers. And then you get to skip all the way up here and go fight the last boss. Prideful timings here aren't ideal. You're going to get one after you kill this stuff, and then you won't have one onto this boss. So that is a drawback of this path, and you can find other paths that do some complicated stuff, like going a little bit into one wing, and then doing a U-turn and going to another wing, that can facilitate a better Prideful timing in this part of the dungeon. So if you're willing to do that, you can certainly find those. My friend Trell has some routes that you can find. I'll link those in the description below, and I think they may accomplish that better than mine does. After you kill this boss, then we're going to the last wing, Gorechop's wing. And here, depending on the affixes, you can maybe fight all of these at once, especially if you've got a lot of burst uncapped AoE. If your AoE is target capped at 5, doesn't matter anyways, right? You're not going to get any benefit by doing it, so you may as well just do it like this. If bursting is active this week, like I think it might be, then you also have another reason to not pull too much here, especially these guys do a really nasty disease that is really annoying if you don't have a disease dispel, so kick that if you can. Kick all the stuff you can on these pulls. AoE stuns, all that, really, really helpful here, especially for then not bleeding out while you have bursting afterwards. These gas bags can be skipped on the either ends of their patrol, well, actually this end of their patrol when they get as far away from you as possible. You can just sneak on through here. That's worth doing. Generally, these things are pretty annoying. They have the Vile Eruption, which is both a frontal and a backle, so you want to avoid that if you can, but they're also just pretty inefficient in terms of count per health that you're dealing with on them. And you get down here, you get a Prideful onto this boss, come up to the last boss, and you're done. That's all the dungeons. That's Mythic Plus this week. Hope this little run through helped you out. I hope you learned something useful. If you did, remember to hit like and subscribe. Check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Stratnos. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll be back next week with another one of these series, and I'll be back before next week with some other videos. Bye.